Good morning, good afternoon, whatever it is where you are. I'm Professor Baruch Bush. I helped to start our Institute for the Study of Conflict Transformation, and also with my partner Joe Folger helped to launch the whole idea of the transformative framework of conflict and intervention. So I've been invited or asked to speak about that framework today, and I'm going to talk about it in terms of sort of three dimensions that I believe are unique about the transformative framework. The first is that we take what I would call an interactional view of conflict itself. I'll explain what that means. The second is that I think by comparison to almost any, if not every other approach to intervention, we take self-determination seriously. We don't just talk about it, but we do it. And number three, we explain the premises, the beliefs that underlie our framework, because we believe that beliefs underlie every framework and that they ought to be articulated. So those are the three things that we do that I think are unique. So let me talk about them in order there. The first, namely the interactional view of conflict. So I guess the first question we could ask is why, quote unquote, invent a new theory and teach a new theory of mediation and intervention? There's plenty of mediation theories around and plenty of training formats to present them. Why did we have to invent something new? So the answer to that is that we discovered in practice and actually sitting with clients in mediation was the inspiration for everything we've done. And what we discovered, first of all, was that agreement, settlement is not what matters most to the parties to conflict. Doing a conference presentation years and years ago on closing the session, I suddenly discovered that it wasn't just about getting an agreement, but rather there was something beyond settlement, beyond agreement, that seemed to matter very much to the parties that we worked with and to us. And therefore we started thinking about what is that? What is it that goes beyond settlement in mediation and intervention? How could we describe it? How could we explain it? And why does it matter seemingly so much both to parties and to interveners? So therefore we went back to basics. We said, well, what is it that we're doing as interveners? What are we responding to? What do parties want from us? Well, they want help in their conflict situation. So therefore we had to ask ourselves, what does conflict mean to our clients? What is it that they want help with? What does help mean to them? And how can we actually offer help that's meaningful to them? And that led us to what we now call the transformative framework and what we see as an interactional framework. So mediation is an intervention in conflict, and it has to be of help to the parties themselves. So we ask ourselves, what is conflict as the parties experience it, and what kind of help do they want and need? And there are a lot of different ways of understanding conflict. There are theories that say conflict is about power and domination, or a struggle to avoid domination. Conflict is about rights. I'm a law professor. I teach rights. There's another theory that says conflict is about needs and interests, and that's a very popular theory with mediators and interveners in particular. So our theory suggests that those are all decent ways to look at conflict, but we don't look at conflict in any of them, in any of those ways. Instead, for us, conflict is a crisis in human interaction. The basic phenomenon that's going on is a human interaction. And that interaction has hit a very big bump in the road and is in a crisis state. And what people want from interveners is help in overcoming that crisis and restoring the kind of interaction that they value and that they think they had before the conflict arose. So that's a pretty vague definition of what conflict is, a crisis in interaction. What do we specifically mean? What we mean is that when people find themselves in conflict, when conflict occurs to them, it tends to destabilize their experience of both themselves and each other, so that they are starting to interact in ways that are more vulnerable and more self-absorbed than they did before the conflict arose. To put it differently, people who find themselves in conflict tend to experience a sense of both relative weakness, as opposed to how they felt before. They feel more confused, fearful, disorganized, vulnerable, powerless, uncertain, indecisive, and also simultaneously relatively more self-absorbed than they were before. Self-protective, defensive, suspicious of the other, hostile, closed-minded. So those are pretty rotten experiences, actually. And in fact, they don't occur independently. They feed into one another. So that the more I feel weak and unsettled and confused, the more I close down and become closed and suspicious of you. The more I become suspicious of you and feel attacked by you, the more I close down and feel weak and vulnerable and afraid. And therefore, there's a feedback loop, which we look at as a vicious cycle of interactional degeneration. Other theorists, like international conflict theorists, look at this as a cycle of conflict escalation. The conflict escalates, and as it does, the interaction degenerates. And it's a feedback loop, so the more I feel weak, the more I get self-absorbed. The more I feel self-absorbed, the weaker I feel, and the weaker you feel, because I'm lashing out at you. So there is this double phenomenon going on as a result of the conflict itself. This is not, we don't consider this pathological. There's nothing wrong with the people that experience this. It's situational. It's not characterological. It's not a bad character that's at effect here. It is a bad situation. And we believe that everybody, to some extent or other, experiences these twin states of deterioration of our sense of self and our sense of connection to other. And that's what goes on in conflict, and that's what makes it very hard. So from a normal, decent human interaction, the interaction degenerates and becomes negative, destructive, demonizing, and alienating. And at worst, what happens is the kind of thing that we see in vicious international conflicts like the ones that occurred, for example, in Bosnia-Herzegovina, in Rwanda. But in fact, this occurs also in our workplaces, in our families, God forbid, in our friendships. Conflict can become very quickly negative and destructive. So I always think of a couple of folks driving along side by side on the freeway in a nice spring day with the windows open and their music playing on their radios, and they're having a great time, and they're sort of nodding at each other as they drive along, and then somebody bumps into somebody. And all of a sudden, it's a totally different situation. Everybody in his own or her own car suddenly starts to feel afraid, weak, disorganized, confused. Where's my insurance? Did I bring my insurance with me? Is my driver's license current? What happened here? Who hit whom? As we pull over to the side of the road, everyone is in a state of essentially falling apart and becoming very confused and hostile to the other party. What should I say? What should I do? Should I be afraid of this person? Do they have a weapon with them? God forbid. So on both sides, the interaction tends to go down and down into the place of negative and destructive. You know, sometimes we say, when we think about it afterwards, boy, I don't know what happened. I went to pieces. So I used to have this little toy. I'm sorry, I don't have it with me. It's one of these little push toys of a stick figure which is held together by rubber bands. And you push on the bottom and the thing falls apart. All the limbs fall off. And that's what it feels like in conflict. We go to pieces, literally. And then, what happens then? Well, also I sort of think about this sometimes. You know, you have a fight with your boss or your friend or your sweetie pie, and you walk out of the room, and the first thing you think of is, why didn't I say that? In other words, I wasn't clear and articulate enough. I didn't say that. I lost my sense of coming up with a good argument. Why didn't I say that? And then after a little bit of time and you calm down, you say, oh no, why did I have to go and say that? Right? That's a different question we ask ourselves. And those two questions reflect these two negative, deteriorating states. Why did I fall apart in myself? Why did I become so hostile to the other party? Why? Well, here's why. Because conflict has that effect on us. But it's not the whole story. Because in a sense, we can look at that kind of negative phenomenon, conflict, as what happens when we catch a cold or a virus. And what happens is that the body feels bad, right? And in this context, the interactional body of the social exchange between the two of us gets sick, feels bad, and begins to deteriorate and become negative and destructive. But just like when we have a cold, we bounce back. Our natural immune response kicks in. We don't automatically have to go to the doctor. We don't automatically have to take antibiotics. We just come back to our good health because the body regenerates. It's resilient, and it comes back to good health. The same thing is true in conflict. People make what we call shifts, positive shifts, out of these negative states of experience, of self and other, to more positive states. So from being unsettled and nervous, we get calmer. From being confused, we get clearer. From being fearful, we become more confident. From being unsure of what to do, we get more decisive. From being inarticulate, we become more articulate and can say what we want to say. And all of that, all of these little mini shifts, we could put them together into a major shift, the shift from weakness, the sense of weakness or loss of competency that we experienced, back to our sense of strength. So we don't mean here that all of a sudden we find out we have more resources, we have a bigger bank account than we thought, we got a payment from IRS. No, we mean loss of a sense of competence back to a regained sense of competence. So we could call that the shift from weakness to strength, or the shift from helplessness to competence, or from helplessness to a greater sense of agency, of our agency over the situation and our own lives. And simultaneously, again, happening at the same time, we have other micro shifts in the realm of our experience of each other, of the other person rather than ourselves. So from being self-protective, we become actually more attentive to the other person. We start out, we're not even aware there's another person there. I'm totally focused on myself. But as I calm down, I suddenly begin to become more aware of you. From defensive, we become more open. From hostile, we become more civil. From suspicious, we become more trusting and willing to see something positive in the other person. From incapable of stepping out of our own frame, we become more able to see the other's perspective. So all these mini shifts accumulate into a macro shift from self-absorption to responsiveness to other. So we can also think of these in other language. We can talk about the state of helplessness and hatefulness that characterizes negative and destructive conflict, to a sense of competence and caring or consideration for the other, which is the positive conflict situation or experience. So if we put all of this together, we come up with a picture, and that's exactly what we constructed for ourselves out of looking at what was happening in the cases that we intervened in for the parties that we were working with. And that situation was the figure that you see now on the screen, if our producer has put it there, which is what we call the conflict transformation graphic, where on the left side you see the negative cycle, the vicious cycle of weakness and self-absorption that pulls interaction down into this territory of negative and destructive and demonizing. But then we see the shift to the positive cycle of strength and responsiveness, of competence and consideration, and the shifts that accumulate for both of those kinds of larger shifts we call the empowerment shift from weakness to strength, and the recognition shift from self-absorption to responsiveness and consideration of other. And when the conflict goes through those shifts, those are really the drivers of what we call conflict transformation. Those are the motivators, the energy force that moves conflict through the cycle from destruction and negativity back to positive and constructive and connecting and humanizing human interaction. Whether or not an agreement has been found, although when conflict reattains that positive state, it's very likely that the parties will in fact find agreement on whatever issues divide them. So this is the picture that we developed of what we call conflict transformation. It was probably too grandiose a word to use, because we're really talking about change, right? Shifting from negative back to positive. Shifting from weakness to strength, from selfishness to consideration for other, and overall shifting from negative and destructive to positive and constructive. And that shift, actually, the reason we use the word transformation is that when you sit with people in conflict or you watch people in conflict and that shift occurs, it looks unbelievably sharp and powerful and transformative. It's like going from darkness to light. It's a transformative change in the interaction of the people involved. And so we use this word transformation, although it's sometimes I guess we wish we hadn't, because maybe it looks too overreaching to describe what's really a very common and usual shift that people make, like we say, back from sickness to health. The truth of the matter is that this all happens usually and frequently, almost always, without the intervention of any intervener at all. If in fact people didn't make these shifts back from negative destructive conflict back to positive and constructive interaction, then we would probably all have killed each other a long time ago. Families wouldn't be able to function, workplaces wouldn't be able to function, the world wouldn't be able to function. But in fact, it does function. It functions because people come back to themselves and to each other. We come back to ourselves, we gather ourselves. I pulled myself together. I fell apart, but I pulled myself back together. And I forgot all about you, but then I remembered you. And so we come back to ourselves and we come back to each other, and all of this happens without the intervention of any third party. That's the normal thing that happens in conflict. Living here in New York, I ride the subways, at least I used to, not so much anymore, but when I did, I always was amazed that people didn't kill each other. People didn't get into bigger fights. They bumped into each other, they stepped on each other's toes, they were crammed into these little subway cars, and yet, I'm sorry, oh no, that's all right, don't worry, and it all worked out without anybody intervening. That's the normal cycle of conflict transformation. But, sometimes people get stuck. Sometimes we all get stuck. We get stuck in the negative and destructive conflict cycle that pulls us down into destructive, demonized human interaction. And that's when we just don't like it. That is our belief about why people come to interveners, mediators, facilitators in the first place. Not because they need some solution to some material problem or relationship problem, but because the interaction that they're having has become poisonous and toxic. And it's a terrible way, it's a terrible experience for everybody. And they don't want to continue in it, but they can't get out of it by themselves. Some people talk about this, like, for example, Aaron Beck, a very famous cognitive psychologist, calls this the prison of hate, prisoners of hate. That's what people become in conflict, prisoners of hate. Literally, negative destructive conflict is like a prison. And when you can't escape from that prison by yourself, you look for help. And help comes maybe in the form of an intervener, like a mediator or a facilitator. When that happens, this is the last piece of the theoretical framework that I want to present before we maybe take a little break, and that is people want to get back. It's like the Beatles, you know, Jojo, get back to the USSR. Well, maybe not to the USSR, but the positive conflict, right? Let's get back. But we can't, we're stuck. So what people want in that stuck place, most of all, is to move back out of that toxic, poisoned interaction into some sort of interaction that is positive and humane and constructive. And that's their motivation. That's what they're looking for. They're not looking for a solution. They're not looking for an agreement. That's why when we saw these cases in front of us, we said, oh, look at that. People care about something beyond agreement. What do they care about? They care about regaining a sense of a positive interaction between them as human beings. Now, you saw this on your presentation, but I once put this picture up in the room, and I like to show it off because it's in color, right? So I don't know if you could see that on the screen. Is that on the screen now? Maybe in front of my face. But look at those nice colors, huh? So there's the empowerment shift from weakness to strength in red because it's very dynamic. And below that is the recognition shift, also in red, from self-absorption to consideration from other. And there's a little feedback loops inside, the vicious circle of destructive conflict, interaction, and the virtuous circle, which is also a feedback loop of positive interaction. But look, there's a diagonal blue arrow right across the page from lower left to upper right. And that's what I want you to see, because that arrow says what people really want, and this is also part of our transformative theory, a key part, what they really want in their conflict is to move back from negative and destructive interaction where they've fallen to positive and constructive interaction, which is where they really want to be. That's the motivation, to change the interaction, to change the interaction. So what gets transformed in transformative conflict interaction? What gets transformed is the parties' interaction. That is what gets transformed. Not necessarily their character, not their beliefs, but their interaction. And let's define that. What shifts, what changes, from what to what? So we've seen from weak and selfish to strong and responsive, from helpless and hateful to competent and caring, from subjugation and isolation to agency and empathy, from reacting to responding, from being reactive to being deliberate, from being imprisoned in negative conflict to being free to interact as fellow human beings. So if we look down at that list of comparisons, we can ask ourselves, where would you rather be? Where would you rather be? On the negative side or the positive side? And it's kind of an obvious question and an obvious answer. I'd rather be on the side of positive interaction, even if we haven't reached an agreement. And if we do reach an agreement, I surely hope that we also change the interaction. Because if we didn't, then probably the agreement won't hold up, won't be worth the paper it's written on, and in any event, we'll still be living in the toxic atmosphere of negative conflict. So that's the last piece of our theory, which is that the motivation that people have in conflict is to move back from the negative and destructive interaction that has developed back to a positive and constructive interaction. Now, why we think that's what motivates people, that's the next step that I want to talk about.